Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Eckert, and if this is your first time joining us for a podcast episode on this show, then thank you for joining. Hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope you will go back through our library of content and listen to some of our previous episodes as well. Some of you who have been listening to this show for a little while might have noticed that I hadn't really posted much content in a while. To be honest, I was kind of focusing a little bit more on my written content that I put out and trying to put some more energy and effort into that. But I had enough people that had reached out just randomly and told me that they enjoyed listening to the podcast that I had put out previously, that I felt I would get back into it in the new year and start putting out some content again on the podcast show more regularly. I am not sure if I'm going to continue going back to posting content every month or if I'm going to keep it to every other month. But I'll see how things go as I get back into the swing of putting out some new shows. And so, I figured though with the new year upon us, though, it was a good time to get back into it. And so hopefully I'll be putting out content a little bit more regularly so that the library of content that I have available continues to grow over time. And so with that said, that brings me now to this podcast episode, in which the focus of the episode will be on muscle cramping during exercise. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this topic and what some of the latest research suggests on this topic, because I had been having some athletes that had been experiencing some cramping lately, and it tends to be something that a lot of athletes deal with at some point. For most, it doesn't necessarily cripple their ability to train, or usually more specifically race is when cramping really starts to show up for a lot of athletes. But for those who do experience pretty severe cramping during racing, it can be pretty serious to the point where they have to stop racing altogether. So I figured it was worthwhile to put out a podcast episode discussing the latest evidence surrounding muscle cramping. The podcast is going to focus specifically on exercise-associated muscle cramps, or EAMCs is sometimes what it's abbreviated as in the research literature. And I say that just because cramping is so broad. It can obviously happen outside of exercise as well. And so just keep in mind as you're listening to some of the evidence that I discuss, it is purely focusing on cramping that happens during exercise. So I'm not necessarily talking about cramping that happens outside of exercise. Cramping, as you will come to find out during exercise, has a lot of different potential causes. So does cramping outside of exercise. A lot of different potential causes and remedies to fix cramping. So it would be a totally different episode to focus on cramping more globally. But in this episode, I'm going to be focusing specifically on exercise-associated muscle cramps, which, if you're an athlete listening to this episode, you will probably be familiar with, as I don't know if I've met many athletes who have raced consistently over long periods of time who have not experienced some level of cramping at one point or another. It's usually something that happens to just about every single athlete if you race long enough. Some athletes might never experience a cramp during training or racing, but that tends to be the minority of athletes, especially endurance athletes. For some athletes, it can occur primarily when they first start getting into the sport, as their body is adapting maybe to a new sport, and as maybe their fitness is kind of improving so that they can tolerate racing whatever distance that it is that they're racing. Like I experienced personally a lot more cramping in the beginning of my endurance athletic endeavors, and I very rarely experience cramping nowadays. And if it does happen, it's usually relatively minor, and it's at like the tail end of a long race or something like maybe a half Ironman. But it very rarely happens to me now, whereas some other athletes, it becomes more and more of an issue over time. And it can be random sometimes for a lot of athletes. It doesn't necessarily always follow a predictable course. It can happen in some races, and then an athlete might do a very similar race and they might experience no cramping. So it can be something that's very frustrating to deal with for athletes. And as the severity and the intensity of the cramping goes up, It can be beyond frustrating for some athletes. It can literally be debilitating to the point where they have trouble finishing races that they spend so much time, energy, money on getting to the start line to race to their potential. So depending on the athlete, it can be a bigger issue to address, especially if I'm working with an athlete, let's say, and they have cramping that becomes a big enough issue to the point where they're struggling to finish races. It can become something that takes a lot of time and energy and effort to figure out what's really going on. And so that was one reason why I really wanted to focus on cramping in this podcast episode. Another one, though, is that exercise-associated muscle cramps is often still a very misunderstood topic. I will get into some of the theories that kind of underpin the etiology or the pathophysiology of cramping during exercise. But basically, a takeaway that you're going to get from this podcast is that researchers and clinicians still don't know exactly what causes cramping. There's a lot of different potential causes to cramping, but there is no specific cause that we've identified in the research to date. And there's a lot of research on this topic. It's not because we haven't done a lot of research over previous decades on this topic. It's just that there is no one clear-cut cause that seems to underpin all exercise-associated muscle cramps. It can be vastly different causes for different athletes. And that's something that you'll find out as I go throughout this episode and start getting into the research. But there's a lot of coaches out there, dietitians potentially, or nutritionists, or fellow athletes who might have experienced success in addressing cramping among themselves or with one athlete or a couple athletes in a certain way. And they might think that that is the sole cause of cramping, and then that might become the one potential remedy that they push or promote as a quote-unquote cure for cramping amongst all the athletes that someone might work with or with other fellow friends that are athletes. And so that's where it can start to lead to misinformation over time that gets spread if there's enough coaches, athletes, dietitians, other professionals that aren't informed on the latest research literature and are under the impression that cramping has a specific cause. Usually what most people tend to believe is that cramping is caused by some type of electrolyte imbalance. And so it's really common if, a fellow athlete talks to maybe another athlete or someone else who does endurance sports, whether they're a professional or not, and they divulge that they have experienced cramping. A lot of the times, one of the first things that people will say in response to that is, well, are you taking enough electrolytes when you train or when you race? Do you take magnesium? Have you tried taking magnesium yet? And then usually also along with electrolytes, it's usually some type of hydration issue that a lot of people will kind of pin as being the reason why they're experiencing cramping. And they're not necessarily wrong. So folks who bring up electrolytes and hydration as potential reasons as to why someone is experiencing cramping is true, but they're potential reasons. It's not the only reason. And it can become dangerous in certain circumstances if an athlete is pushed to believe that their cramping is due to electrolytes and they keep taking more and more and more electrolytes during training or racing. And that can be potentially dangerous because you can overdo it with electrolytes or with fluid intake as well. If some athletes think that their recurrent cramping when they race is due to dehydration, they might almost consume too much water in an effort to stop the cramping. And obviously too much fluids with not enough electrolytes can potentially be dangerous and lead to a state of hyponatremia. The same can be said as well for someone who consumes far too much electrolytes. Whether it's sodium or potassium or magnesium. Not only can it lead to potential medical issues, which might require someone to actually be hospitalized or put on IV fluids, but taking too many electrolytes can also lead to some pretty severe GI distress as well, especially combined with fatigue and heavy exertion when someone is racing, which is usually when people experience cramping and they might overdo it on fluids or electrolytes. So it can be potentially dangerous if some athletes are under the impression that they need to consume more of something, be it fluids or electrolytes, in order to combat cramping, when the potential issue might not even be fluids or electrolytes to begin with, because those are just two potential underlying causes of cramping. So that's another reason that I wanted to dive into this topic a little bit as well, is to kind of dispel some of the common misbeliefs around exercise-associated muscle cramping, and then to kind of shed some light on some very recent research on this topic, so that athletes, coaches, other professionals are a little bit more informed, hopefully, on what the potential causes are of muscle cramping, even though there's a lot of potential causes. And then not necessarily a single thing that you can do to prevent cramping, but more of like a checklist of items you can run through with yourself as an athlete, or if you're a coach or another professional with athletes, in order to potentially identify what their specific underlying cause of cramping might be. But again, we do not know what the cause of cramping is. So there is no such thing as take this or do this and it will prevent cramping. That just simply does not exist based on the current research literature that we have. All right, but before I dive into some recent research literature kind of summarizing this topic of cramping during exercise, it's important for me to start first with what are some of the proposed theories or mechanisms behind muscle cramping. And these theories and mechanisms have evolved over time. So one of the first theories that was put out that tried to explain muscle cramping was a dehydration and electrolyte imbalance theory. So this was a few decades ago. It's been around for a while, and there's been some holes that have been poked in it over time. So it's no longer the leading theory supporting muscle cramping during exercise. But this theory was basically postulating that a certain level of dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, whether it's too much or too little, leads to a state in which there is the potential for overexcitation of muscle fibers, or of the muscle in general, and that can increase the likelihood in which cramps can occur. And one commonality among all the theories that you'll hear is that these theories are all trying to figure out which potential causes create a state in which there's overexcitation of muscle fibers, which can lead to involuntary contractions or cramps. That we know is probably what is likely happening when someone experiences a cramp. There is some level of overexcitation of the muscle fiber or fibers involved in the muscle that's cramping. That we do know for sure. But there are a variety of reasons or potential causes as to why there might be overexcitation of muscle fibers or of a muscle that would lead to cramping. And we used to think that it was potentially dehydration and electrolyte imbalances, but that has since evolved. And the second theory that emerged after the dehydration and electrolyte imbalance theory was altered neuromuscular control theory. And this really just added another element to that initial theory, and it kind of threw into the mix muscle fatigue. So this theory kind of came around in the late 90s and was one of the leading theories up until kind of 2010. And this theory proposed that a combination of dehydration, electrolyte imbalance, and fatigue thrown into the mix increases the likelihood of overexcitation of muscle fibers, thereby leading to a greater likelihood of cramping. But since then, a newer theory has evolved that is called the multifactorial theory of exercise-associated muscle cramps. And this one kind of again adds to the previous theory, and it takes into account a broad range of factors that can essentially lead to a state in which there is some increased excitation of muscle fibers. And there's a variety of potential causes or risk factors that could lead to a state in which cramping is more likely to occur. And it's important to remember that all these factors that I'll kind of discuss increase the likelihood that cramping is experienced. There's no guarantee that if these risk factors are present, that an athlete is going to experience cramping. Some athletes, it might be dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. That could be for them the two specific items that increase the risk of them cramping. But it's not going to be a 100% guaranteed outcome of cramping if that athlete experiences dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. There might be some times when they do cramp when they're dehydrated and low on electrolytes, and there might be other times when they don't. And that kind of gets into the area in which we just don't know the one exact cause. And there is no one exact cause or two specific causes. There are just risk factors that increase the likelihood that cramping occurs. Because again, it might occur sometimes for athletes and not other times. And each athlete might have a different combination of factors that increase the likelihood of them experiencing cramping during exercise. So this newer theory, multifactorial theory of exercise-associated muscle cramps, takes into account a wide variety of potential factors that can increase the likelihood of cramping occurring. And there's too many for me to even go over. And so I'll link into the show notes a write-up that I actually did on this topic. It's kind of a more in-depth write-up on exercise-associated muscle cramping. And within that, I include an image that describes, it came from a recent publication, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But it basically, it's a big graph or figure that describes all the potential causes that could lead to an increased likelihood of exercise-associated muscle cramping. And it includes things such as dehydration, electrolyte imbalances, fatigue, but it also takes into account a variety of other factors. So for example, like prior muscle injury or damage can increase the likelihood in some folks that they experience cramping. Certain medications or supplements that impact the central nervous system might increase the likelihood of an athlete experiencing cramping. For some athletes, it could be heat stress. It could be exposure to higher altitudes. There's a variety of factors, and that's kind of the point of this theory, is that there are a variety of factors that we know are related to cramping, but there is no one specific mixture of risk factors that is guaranteed to lead to cramping. It's just things that increase the likelihood that cramping occurs. And so with that most recent theory, although it doesn't necessarily describe what an athlete can do specifically in order to prevent cramping, which can be frustrating for a lot of athletes who do experience pretty severe cramping, it does provide a lot of potential reasons that athletes can work through as to why they might be experiencing cramping. So although it is frustrating that there isn't a specific item or a couple items that we know causes cramping, we do have a pretty good idea now with all the research that's been done on this topic that there are a variety of risk factors when it comes to cramping that athletes can work on addressing. Let's take a quick break and talk about Buzzsprout, the platform that I use to host this podcast show. Whether you're looking for a new marketing channel, have a message you want to share with the world, or just think it would be fun to have your own talk show, podcasting is an easy, inexpensive, and fun way to expand your reach online. And Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online and listed in all major podcast directories, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and many more, within minutes of finishing your recording. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and the team at Buzzsprout is passionate about helping you succeed like they've helped me. Join over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get your message out to the world. And if you want to sign up and start your own Buzzsprout podcast hosting platform, click the link in the show notes and you can get a $20 Amazon gift card after signing up. And so it's really this most recent theory that is most useful for coaches and athletes when it comes to potentially working through muscle cramping, especially if it's intense enough and severe enough and it recurs often enough that it actually starts to affect an athlete's ability to race. So this is really where athletes should be turning their attention to, and coaches as well if they're working with athletes that are regular crampers, is turning to this most recent theory and working through essentially what is a checklist of items to see what the potential risk factors are that an athlete might have that increases the likelihood of them experiencing their cramping. And so also within the write-up that I'll link to in the show notes that I did, there's a table that I include that is essentially like a step-by-step questionnaire that will help athletes and coaches identify what potential risk factors might be present that are explaining the cramping that an athlete is experiencing. And so I won't go through every single question, But essentially, these questions are based off of that multifactorial theory on exercise-associated muscle cramps. And it basically walks the athlete through all the different potential risk factors that are related to cramping, so that the athlete can get a better idea of maybe risk factors that they don't have and then risk factors that they do have. And that's really what an athlete needs to understand, so that they can target and potentially treat their muscle cramping that they experience in more of an evidence-based fashion than just simply turning to hydration and electrolytes, which is what a lot of athletes and coaches kind of turn to. Because it might be that an athlete is experiencing cramping for something totally unrelated to hydration and electrolyte issues. And so it just helps athletes and coaches hopefully avoid that rabbit hole of going too far down the pathway of addressing one specific risk factor or two specific risk factors that might not even be present in an athlete who's experiencing cramping. And so the write-up that I linked to in the show notes will be really useful for you as an athlete, or if you're, say, a coach or another professional listening to this podcast episode. Within that write-up, I have not only an image that kind of describes the most recent multifactorial theory, so you can get a better sense of how some of these risk factors interact with each other, but you also will have access to an image of questions that I've literally pulled from a 2022 systematic review on this topic. That is a really good place for athletes or coaches to start with when it comes to trying to work through addressing risk factors related to cramping that an athlete might be experiencing. So that would be my best suggestion based on the research literature that we have at the moment when it comes to actually working on preventing and treating muscle cramping, or preventing muscle cramping, I should say, from taking place during racing or during training if you're an athlete who experiences it during training as well. So that's my best recommendation that I currently have based on the research literature that we have to date. So try and avoid going down the rabbit hole of just one or two specific items that are maybe most commonly thrown around as related to cramping, which tends to be dehydration and electrolyte imbalances. Another couple items that are common but aren't quite as common as dehydration and electrolyte issues is fatigue, or some athletes or coaches might suggest strength training as being the thing to include to prevent muscle cramping. And while working through potential hydration, electrolyte, fatigue, or strength training issues, if those are present, could potentially help an athlete address and prevent cramping from taking place, they might not be the specific risk factors for all athletes, right? And so that's where it is really, really useful to work through all the potential factors that could be in play when it comes to preventing cramping from taking place, or working on reducing the severity and the intensity and the regularity of cramping from taking place. Because again, any athlete who takes place in, especially an endurance event, there's always going to be some risk of experiencing cramping, even if you perfectly address every single risk factor that we know is related to cramping. So there's always going to be some sort of risk. But I think that one of the most important things for athletes and coaches to be aware of when it comes to working with maybe more intense and regular crampers is that there are ways of reducing the intensity of those cramps and reducing the regularity with which those cramps take place so that it doesn't impact an athlete's ability to race. And that's what's most important. But there's always going to be some level of like mild cramping taking place. And there's nothing that you can really do, any athlete can do, to completely get rid of that risk altogether. It's really just about making sure if it is an issue for you as an athlete or for an athlete that you're working with as a coach, trying to reduce the likelihood of those cramps from taking place and reducing the intensity and severity of them if they do take place so that an athlete can still continue to perform at their best on race day. So that's really all that athletes and coaches can do when it comes from a prevention standpoint. When it comes to actually treating muscle cramping during exercise, whether it's training or racing, there's really not a whole lot that can be done. Typically what the research tends to suggest is that the best way of getting rid of cramping that won't stop is to stop the activity altogether. So there are certain circumstances in which some athletes, this has happened to me as well previously in some races, where athletes are racing and they might experience cramping intermittently throughout the race. So it might come on and then it might stop all of a sudden. So like, for example, on a personal level, what oftentimes happens with me is, especially during a triathlon event, especially if it's like a half Ironman distance or longer, so more of like a longer distance triathlon, sometimes I'll experience cramping in my legs transitioning from the bike to the run, just because of the way that I'm shifting a lot of the work that's being done throughout the musculature of my lower body. And usually it'll just work itself out after I get past about maybe a mile or two on the run. But then sometimes it might come back again on the back half of the run as, like, say, fatigue and maybe some other risk factors start to come into play that increase the likelihood of cramping occurring. But sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And so for me, I've really never had severe enough muscle cramping that I've had to pull out of a race. But for some athletes, it does get severe enough where they do have to actually stop exercising altogether. And that's really all an athlete can do if it does get intense enough or severe enough to the point where they can no longer continue. The best way of getting those cramps to stop is just stopping the activity altogether. But for athletes who are exercising, especially in a race where they're trying not to stop, they're trying to continue performing at their best, there's really not a whole lot that you can do in the moment in order to treat it. Sometimes stopping and stretching the muscle that's cramping, or maybe rubbing on it a little bit and kind of massaging it, that can sometimes help, and the research literature does suggest that as a potential treatment if it's mild enough. And sometimes that can be enough to help an athlete get through a race. They might just have to stop a few times and stretch the muscle out, maybe manually massage it a little bit, and sometimes that can be just enough to hold off the cramping from causing them to stop completely. But honestly, if the cramping is bad enough, the best suggestion that we have is to stop altogether. And then if it continues even after stopping exercising, then usually that's where you might have to go to the med tent if there is one at a local race, and potentially work with an actual medical professional. Usually they'll have like some kind of nurse on staff there that might be able to help you. And then if it still continues, even beyond stopping and working with a nurse, maybe they hook you up to an IV to get some fluids in you or some electrolytes in you. But if that's still not working, then you might potentially have to go into the emergency room and get treated by a physician, if it's bad enough and severe enough. But that's usually pretty rare for most athletes. Usually the two options that you have as an athlete is to, if it's mild enough, stop, stretch it, massage it yourself. Obviously continue eating, hydrating, taking in electrolytes as planned, but there really is no research literature to suggest that taking additional or taking more fluids and electrolytes than what you would normally take is going to help, especially once the cramping has come on. If it is related to a dehydration or electrolyte issue, then usually it's too late at that point if you're experiencing severe cramping. And it's not normally recommended even then to just start to overdo it with hydration and electrolytes. Obviously continue at the regular intake that you would for fluids and electrolytes, but there's no research literature to suggest at this point that athletes who are experiencing cramping should take on more fluids and electrolytes in order to treat it when it's already happening. So usually it's just, if it's mild enough, stop, stretch it, massage it. If it continues and it's severe enough to the point where it's debilitating, then usually you just have to stop altogether, or try and work your way through it as best you can to at least get to the finish line. But then usually then it's just stopping the activity is what really stops the cramping. And that's based on the research literature that we have available to us to date. So that's kind of the best we have at the moment. I realize that some of this research literature that we have to date isn't the most encouraging and can still be a little frustrating for athletes who do really struggle with cramping when they race in particular, which is where it is usually most frustrating for athletes. But there is obviously more and more research literature that's emerging, and as our theories become more updated over time, obviously there's more potential risk factors that we identify, and therefore more things that athletes can work on addressing. But I guess if I was to maybe conclude this episode and kind of summarize everything that we know based on the research literature to date, it would be this. If you're an athlete or, again, a coach working with an athlete and the athlete is experiencing regular cramping and it's intense enough and severe enough that it's impacting their performance and it's something that you actually need to start working on addressing, the best place to start is working through some type of cramping related checklist that gets you to basically consider and identify potential risk factors that are related to cramping and then address the potential risk factors if they're present. And again, some of those risk factors you might have to work with different professionals to address. So for example, some of them you might be able to work with your coach. So let's say it's related to just hydration or electrolyte intake, or maybe it's related to muscle fatigue, like you notice that usually it happens at the tail end of races when you're most fatigued, and maybe that's a risk factor. Those are things that your coach could help you with. But if it's related to something like a prior muscle injury or maybe an injury that you currently have, and maybe that's potentially related to cramping that an athlete is having, that might require work with a physical therapist, for example. If it's related to medications or supplements that are prescribed for an athlete to be taking for a certain condition that they're managing outside of exercise and training, that might be something that you would have to get the athlete's physician on board with. And the physician will be the best one to help an athlete work through potential alternatives with something that they might be prescribed. So it might be a bit of a time-consuming and laborious task to work through, but it's worth it in the end to ultimately work through all the potential risk factors that are related to cramping if it is becoming enough of an issue. So that's honestly the best place to go. And again, I'll link into the show notes a write-up that I did on this topic. And within that, there's an image that's pulled directly from a 2022 systematic review, which I've discussed in this podcast episode quite a bit up to this point. And within that, it's a 16-item questionnaire that basically helps an athlete or a coach working with an athlete run through a variety of potential risk factors that's based off of the most current theory that we have on exercise-associated muscle cramps. So that's the best place to start. And hopefully over time, the intensity, severity, and regularity of cramping goes down. And then the end goal should be hopefully to make it so that it's happening so infrequently or it's so mild that it doesn't necessarily impact an athlete's ability to race. But just know that there's always a risk of cramping taking place when you undertake any type of athletic event. You're never going to completely eliminate that risk. Even athletes who maybe have been training and racing for a decade or more, they might not have struggled much with cramping in the past, but maybe a risk factor potentially comes into the picture that they don't even think about. Maybe they start on a medication or they start on a supplement or they get an injury, and then all of a sudden they start experiencing cramping when they race. And so it can change and fluctuate over time. But it's best to go to the research literature that we have, work through the risk factors that we know increase the likelihood of cramping, and try and address the ones that might potentially be present. So if I had to summarize everything that we know up to date, that would be it. And again, as always, I'll be sure to link into the show notes the references that I've referenced or the papers that I've referenced in this podcast episode, so you can do a little bit more reading on the topic if you want to dive into some of the research literature yourself. Again, I'll link into the show notes a write-up I did on this topic, so you can actually read through that write-up, and I go into a little bit more detail on some topics within that write-up. And so that'll be available to you as well. And then obviously images and whatnot that I've referenced in this podcast episode as well will be included in that write-up. So hopefully this episode was useful for you if you are an athlete yourself who struggled with cramping, or if you're a coach who works with athletes and you've had athletes that have struggled with cramping, or maybe you're just an athlete or a coach who's curious on what the latest evidence says on this topic. Hopefully you found this episode useful and the content within it useful. Whatever the reason was for you wanting to listen to this episode today. So that's all I have on the topic of muscle cramping during exercise. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hopefully you got something useful out of it, learned something new that you can apply to yourself as an athlete or to your coaching practice if you're a coach. And I hope you will continue to tune in to future episodes on the VO2 Max podcast. thank you for tuning in to today's episode. The support is greatly appreciated. If you want to support the show a little bit more, I have set up a Patreon link, and I've included that Patreon link in the show notes. So if you feel like giving us a little bit of extra support, feel free to do so through Patreon. Also, feel free to give us a review or a star rating, depending on which platform you are listening on. Those reviews and the feedback is greatly appreciated. And then finally, if you know of someone who would be interested in our podcast show, feel free to share this episode or just the podcast in general with them, and that is greatly appreciated. As always, thank you for tuning in to today's episode, and thank you for supporting the show.